Welcome to CoramBAAF Conversations, a podcast series dedicated to adoption, fostering and kinship care. We ask children's social care professionals and experts by experience to join us to share with us and you, our listeners, their experiences, reflections and knowledge. I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to today's podcast. My name is James Berry. I'm Head of Policy Research and Development at CoramBAAF. I'm a children's social worker. And today I'm really pleased to be joined by Anthony. Anthony, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm a researcher at Coram, working in the intersection between lived experience and identity. I've recently published a paper on what I call complex identity, which we'll be getting into later, and thinking about its implications for practitioners in the youth sector. I also am a co-founder of a project called In Between Lines, which is an exhibition and community for people belonging to multiple races, families and cultures.
Just thank you so much for talking to me today. We're publishing this episode as part of our programme for our annual Members Week. And this year's theme is all about listening to children and young people. One of the areas we're going to be focusing on is about identity during that week, and listening to children and young people and identity. And can I just ask you, what did your research say about listening to young people in relation to their identity?
My research says lots of things about that, but it is research that is literally about listening to young people's identity, because this paper was produced as part of Coram's Youth Insight group, which is part of their upcoming Institute for Children. And this is an opportunity and a pathway for young people who have just finished their degrees and have an aspect of their work that they really want to spotlight with a large organization such as Coram, to produce research that will be talked about and discussed with senior members of Coram, like we're doing now, for example. So listening to young people is really important, obviously, in the youth sector, because peer research is a key part of improving services, making sure that we're responsive to young people and to their needs and concerns, but also in listening to their ideas and improving practice and reflecting specifically in this case what Great Britain is like in the 21st century, and making sure that we can have more complex and sophisticated conversations around identity.
Was that a direct intention behind conducting the research on complex identities, or were there other intentions that you had when you conducted the research?
So the original purpose and plan of this work was that I was working in adoption, and when I created In Between Lines, there were 4 of us originally who grew up in 5 different countries, had completely different intersections. Some of us were adopted, some of us weren't, some of us were mixed heritage, some of us weren't. Yet something connected us in terms of this having access to multiple cultures, ways of life, spaces, but not quite belonging to any of them or finding a sense of self within one of them. So when we started doing exhibitions and public events, this would happen as well. And when I would try and explain this to mental health and adoption leaders, they would kind of understand, but I couldn't find any research that would back this up. So this paper was fine, I'll do it myself kind of moment, where I really wanted to connect the lived experience of young people, but also people in general, to these big organizations, and to ground this lived experience in more objective ways of thinking around identity. So it's grounded in an intersectional framework within, like, the UK Equality Act, for example, and within the UK peer research context. And so this is a very exploratory paper that is just trying to map out the terrain and to begin to sort of show the beginning of where the research could take us. But what I'm hoping is that people who have more sophisticated or bigger research expertises, whether that's in a PhD or professorship, can build on this research and begin to link up all the various areas in which complex identities find themselves. So not just in care experience, for example, but also in race, in gender, in disability, in nationality. And so we can begin to weave this web of better conversations around identity.
Thank you. And just thinking about those sort of better conversations about identity, having sort of published or been working on your research, how have you found those conversations about identity? How's your research? How have you found it to have your research received by other people and interpreted?
It's been really wonderful. The reception's been bigger than I ever could have expected. I had the opportunity to present my work along with my colleague Zoe Lambert at a Youth Insight Forum, which was the first of its kind, where we had experts and practitioners from research and also from adoption and youth agencies to discuss this work. And I think they found it really helpful for talking about groups of people that they were working with, whether that's care experience, whether that's donor-conceived individuals, whether that's same-sex or LGBTQ plus parents. There were some really fascinating spin-offs of that conversation. So I think, again, you provide the sort of launch pad or the template for this sort of work or way of thinking around identities, and then people just take it in such amazing directions. So I'm excited to see where it continues to go. But yeah, it's been really helpful in that regard to see the excitement, dare I say, around this kind of work.
They're so positive, and I can sort of understand, having read the research, sort of why there is that sort of positive response and the ideas that it sort of triggers in people when you read it. But I just thought, for people listening today, can you tell me a little bit about the complex identity framework as a concept? What is that, so that people can understand how you framed that in your research?
Of course. So the idea is that we all have various identities, and we have various social categories to which those identities belong to. So, for example, myself as a British national, the social category is nationality, and I have one identity for that. And so for a lot of people, this one-to-one relationship between an identity and a social category is enough for a sense of belonging and group membership. So yeah, someone who is ethnically British would have an equivalent one for ethnicity, and then we have similar ones for any sort of social category you could think about, whether that's number of languages spoken or any kind of like disability, or the point is it's not just about race or gender or care experience, for example. And so a complex identity framework is the idea that some people actually have multiple identities in a single social category. So, for example, people with mixed ethnicity have multiple identities in the category of ethnicity. Extended to, if you think about an immigrant, for example, they will have multiple identities in the category of nationality. And for people with care experience, they might have multiple identities in the category of family. And so what the research identifies is that this multiplicity creates a certain psychological profile that persists independent of the intersections or the heritage of the person who has it. And so these people who have what I call complex identities have the ability to access multiple spaces in the widest sense of the term. So different friends, traditions, foods, dances, languages. They have this experience, they have this ability to experience and to move through all of those, but they also have this experience of being in between worlds, being in between cultures. And that, in my research, is a neutral space. It can either be a negative experience where you don't feel like you belong anywhere, or it can be a positive experience where you're able to fuse all of those influences into a cohesive sense of self. The third experience of people with complex identities is marginalization, where the multiplicity of their identity is condensed in order to fit in society. So we see that with, for example, you look at forms around race and ethnicity, and mixed people do not have an option to label their various countries of origin, their various ethnic origins. They just have the category mixed other or white and black Caribbean. And then the final sort of experience of this profile is connection across categories. And this is harking back to this original exhibition and work that we do with In Between Lines, where no matter the countries that people are from, or again, their intersections or even their age, people are able to connect with other people with complex identities because they have a complex identity, because they're able to appreciate that liminality and fluidity of identity, and that experience of sometimes not having a home at all, but in the healthy version, in having multiple homes and being, not just fit into one box, and to have a sense of multiplicity.
Yeah, you explain that sort of so well, and how people sort of navigate and move, as I said, in between identities, and how that can be, amazingly empowering, but also can be, quite, have a different or a negative feeling or a neutral feeling. And I think it's really important to hear that. And I was thinking that from my sort of social care background as a social worker, trying to explore people's or children's identities and sort of understand them and understand their backgrounds and their heritage and some of the limitations of our own processes. And one of the things that really struck me is when in your research you talked about you want to speak nearby individuals and not for them through this research. And I just wondered if you could sort of say a little bit more about that, because I think sometimes with social work you can get caught in trying to speak for people, and that's tricky, I think.
When I was putting together the paper and the various accounts, I have lived experience of some of those accounts of adoption and mixed heritage, but others I didn't. And I felt very conscious of the fact that I didn't want to say that this is the definitive way in which, for example, a third culture kid experiences moving between countries as a child, because I don't have that lived experience. And so despite that, I still wanted to show that there's several of these accounts of in-betweenness and complexity across the various dimensions, whether that's, again, nationality, care experience. I wanted to begin to join them up. And so this concept of speaking nearby rather than speaking for is just wonderful, in that what this research is trying to do is to start a conversation and to start a dialogue, and to kind of, again, begin to map it out, rather than this is the definitive experience of what it's like to be an adoptee, or what it's like to be someone who's mixed heritage or someone who's disabled. I do not have all of the experiences in that paper, but that doesn't mean that I can't, when writing the paper, give other people the chance to flesh it out, because I'm very happy. I'm so happy. I love this work so much that if someone came in and was like, no, it's actually like this, then, that's wonderful. And because this topic is so much bigger than one person writing it, it's really important that you make that really clear, so that you don't unintentionally offend, or even begin to define an entire community's identity or journey based on your own limited worldview.
And I think that's why I quite like that concept of sort of being nearby people, because I'm sort of conscious that with social work you often have to write about people or write about people's identity, and ideally you'd use people's own words, but when you can't always do that, you want to sort of do that in the right way. And I thought speaking about nearby people and talking maybe to some of their experiences is a really powerful way of thinking about it. Would you mind sharing some of the other key findings at all, please?
Of course. One of the most fascinating findings that I found was that it's not just limited to sort of geography, these concepts of nationality, race, and culture, and within that, like adoption and the process of moving across countries, or being placed with a different family. I found that it also was present in, for example, disability communities. So hearing children of deaf adults have to navigate this, the deaf world and the hearing world, which are sociologically and culturally distinct, and also have this sense of being in between both of those. Similarly, there's evidence in bisexual populations that they have this sense of being in between, and just not really being understood by either the heterosexual community or the LGBT community. And it was really interesting to see that that wasn't just a geographical phenomenon. One also fantastic piece of research that I found was Sarah Gafer's work on mixed identity, and that this concept of acknowledging multiple identities exists empirically, and it has effects on performance. So, for example, reminding mixed heritage individuals that they have multiple identities rather than a single dominant identity, which is usually their minority identity, ends up it means that they can solve more creative problems compared to if you only acknowledge their minority culture. And so that has really important implications for how we talk about multiple populations, where we need to not push down people's identities so that it fits into one category. Acknowledging that we have many places and many sources of our sense of self can actually have beneficial outcomes and tangible outcomes for performance and creativity.
Within that, you talked about some of the research that inspired you. And I just wonder if there's any other sort of research that have inspired you with, when you embarked on this.
One really amazing person in the course of this entire research has been Ruth van Reken, who has, for the past 40 years, been working with what's called third culture kids. And so these are individuals who moved abroad with their parents during their childhood for work. So it could be military missions, could be diplomacy, could be corporate jobs, it could be studying, for example, and then return to their country, original country, or their parents' country when they at some point later. And Ruth has managed to follow in the footsteps of some other amazing researchers and just create a real community around third culture kids that is present nowadays and has a really established online base and has meetups and has really began to move this sort of thinking again away from lived experience but into research. So there are more and more third culture kid PhDs being started. And I reached out to her during the start of my research, and she has been such a source of strength in writing this paper and also navigating the difficulties in getting people to listen to this kind of stuff. Because I want to be transparent. I have a bachelor's, but I don't have a master's. I don't have a PhD. And the issue is that when people try and research this for their PhD or, do a proper study, they've been dissuaded to by their supervisors because there wasn't any research on the topic. So you see this vicious cycle of nothing gets produced because there's no research to link it to. And so what I tried to do with this paper was to be that piece of research for someone to build off of eventually for a master's or PhD. And then maybe we can begin to build on Ruth's work, but do that in other areas. So particularly in care experience, which is probably what we're going to talk about today.
And it's fascinating to hear you talk about third culture kids. It's sort of as you're talking, I was just suddenly going, I think that's sort of connected with my own childhood actually, and sort of a description, and then thinking about some of the things you've been talking about earlier and those sort of in between cultures. So just fascinating for me. And there's any other researchers as well that I know there's some other sort of researchers have published sort of really powerful pieces recently on sort of identity, and I just wonder if there's anyone else you want to reference at all.
Of course. So particularly within the field of care experience, I really want to highlight University of Coventry's work. I think that's Saria Saruvalil Contractor, Alison Halford, and Kushranand's Expressions of Self research. And so I actually use this as one of the sources in my literature review. And so this was looking at transracially care experienced individuals in their teens and how they talked about identity. And so this work was also published in 2024, literally as I was starting to write my paper. And it's amazing the similarity in language, the way that they talk about influx identities, navigating the multiple cultural worlds that the young person experiences in their foster home, adoptive home, within their own, psyche. And they also use the term complex identities. And so that really resonated with me. And of course, they're established researchers. So what my paper's trying to do is have a bit more of a bird's eye view, but I'd really like to shout out that paper as a really fantastic deep dive into how young people construct their sense of identity, especially when they've got multiple cultural backgrounds, both ethnically and within their home. Secondly, I'd really like to highlight the AFDIT framework by Dr. Tam Kane. I participated in some of the research for that. And I really like this piece of research because it's a really holistic sort of way of thinking about decision making and about, how adoptees can have multiple aspects of identity that isn't just race, but goes beyond that into religion and, family, home. And I think the key point with both of those papers is that it's really important to not have an attitude of competency. You don't need to know every single facet of the young person's identity, but what you do need is empathy, and you need to validate the struggles that people might have and the fact that people don't know, especially in the context of care experience when there's often not a lot of information, not a lot of records of their own family and heritage. So again, my paper is not just about care experience. It's trying to link up several movements so that resources can be shared and knowledge can be shared. But within care experience, I think Dr. Tam Kane's work and Expressions of Self work has been really, really fantastic to give you more specifics for, being a practitioner or working in that space.
Totally agree with you. I just think that they're amazing pieces of work, but I just think when I read your research and then considered their research as well, exactly as you said, talking about complex identities and identities in flux, it just there's very similar messaging, very similar language in them. And I just think I found them really powerful when considering what practice should look like when you're working with children and families, actually, and how you really explore people's and children's identities in a way that is, as you said, with empathy. And I suppose what, apart from that sort of empathy, is there anything else that you would like practitioners to think and learn about from the framework that you set out? So if a social worker read your research, for instance, what would you hope they took from that, perhaps?
My research, as opposed to Dr. Tam Kane's and University of Coventry research, as I said, is not so much about giving practical tips, but it's about a way of seeing the world. Complex identity is not a designation of a group of people or a community as much as it is a way of viewing complexity and really increasing the zoom on identities rather than looking at it in a really simplistic way. So I think what reading this research can help you do is to just appreciate the sheer complexity and variety of factors that can influence a young person as they grow up, both in terms of their heritage and the aspects of themselves, their queer identity, along with the trauma of care experience, but also the people around them. their parents, who have their own identity journey, their siblings who might also be care experienced or might not be care experienced, or have a whole variety of factors. And again, the purpose of that isn't to understand and to have a perfect response to every combination of attributes or identities, because that's just going to be impossible. It's about just understanding the potential avenues in which identity can manifest, or identity difficulties can arise, and really just learning to hold that. And again, thinking about this work, I think maybe in care experience, just from my experience, we tend to think of race as like the really dominating aspect of identity that prompts a lot of these discussions. But members of the care experience community can also be disabled, they can also be queer, they can also be, in a sense, immigrants if they're inter-country adoptees. And so it's really important to have a sense that we're all fundamentally related, and there's no like single group of care experience people, or group of mixed heritage people, or a group of any other sort of combination of people. All of those communities contain everyone else. And so again, it's like I can't give specific practical recommendations because, one, I'm not a social worker, and instead what I want to do is to just encourage people to just think a bit more deeply, and to, instead of ignoring complexity, learn to commune with it, and to really just develop a sense of empathy and understanding for not just young people, but for anyone that they encounter.
Thank you, Anthony. I think it's really powerful. I think it is it's a really important message of just exploring people's identity, taking that time to get to know them, understand the different facets to anyone, and knowing that they can change, and knowing that you're never going to get to the bottom of everyone's identity. But if you don't try and explore it and have curiosity, you're not going to get anywhere, are you, as well? So I just think that there's a powerful message in just actually making those endeavors and doing that humbly. I suppose, is there anything else that you want our members and listeners to take away from this research?
As I explain to more people outside those sort of core communities, that where this idea of being in between and multiplicity isn't so much acknowledged, I really want to highlight that it's a lens. It's not just a group of people. When I talk to British people and they talk about, this might not apply to me or whatnot in terms of ethnicity, if you do a DNA test, it's still going to come up as Welsh, Scottish, Irish. These sort of national boundaries or borders don't really exist when you look into, literally a DNA of it. And of course, in matters of social justice, it's really important to listen to the least represented voices, or the voices that don't traditionally get listened to. But in terms of, just conversations with people, you don't need to have the exact same lived experience as someone else in order to connect with them. That doesn't mean that I'm going to understand what moving countries is like, for example, or another experience that isn't directly mine. But what this paper is trying to promote is this idea of connection across difference, that what unites us is our complexity as much as it is the in-groups that we belong to. It's not just an either or of, you completely understand someone or you don't. It's more about, acknowledging the both and all of the communities are fundamentally related, as I said before. I would say also for members and organizations, I think it's really important, again, to listen to young people and to also fund grassroots groups, because those groups are the cutting edge of lived experience. And research like this won't be produced if we're not providing resources for people to express those ideas. Because, as I was saying before, you can get trapped in that if you don't pick up a problem, then it's not a problem kind of mentality. And if the tools which you use to engage with your target community don't pick it up, and that doesn't mean the problem doesn't exist. It just means that your organization isn't doing enough to connect with them.
One of the things we talked about before we set this up was just about inspiring other researchers. And I just wondered if there's just sort of, before we sort of wrap up for today, is there anything you would like to share about your research, about what you hope it might inspire, what you hope it might bring out, or what might follow on, and just some of those aspirations? Because I think when we talked, it was there's a real aspirational part of that discussion. I thought it'd be really interesting to pull that out just as we finish.
The research I did was very exploratory and descriptive. What I'd love to see is organizations that are working with target communities to begin conducting more quantitative or extensive qualitative research, really trying to map out this experience of in-betweenness. So, for example, if we're looking at demographic forms, we're looking at concepts of ethnicity rather than just having lumped groups for mixedness, which don't really exist at all, because mixedness isn't its own community. It's produced by two separate ethnicities in a sense. If we could begin to have options for putting down the multiple countries from which you're from, I think would enable researchers to have a much more powerful analysis, especially when, tying it to things around mental health or access to certain opportunities. So I think that would be really interesting. I would love to see more accounts of complex identities in as many spaces as possible. I'm only one person. I chose the accounts that most clearly brought out and teased out these experiences in a way that just made it obvious for everyone. But for example, we had other categories which included queer identity and disability. I'd love to see stuff in more domains. When I was having my work responded to by Susan Gollenbach, who's an emeritus professor of family research at the University of Cambridge, she was talking about how a complex identity framework could apply to donor-conceived individuals and also to LGBTQ plus families. And, again, this experience of having multiple parts of yourself located in different places. And so I'd really love to explore more the concept of family structure as a complex identity and the various permutations, especially as like the idea of the nuclear family just becomes more and more a relic of the past. We need to really be understanding how not just the aspects within you, but the people around you can influence your sense of self and how you relate to other people.
And I think there's sort of aspects of systemic family therapy and systemic models as well that you sort of like branch into. But I think you're absolutely, really amazing thoughts there about the different places and ways that people have their identity or find their identity or identities. Could you also just share any other key findings that you'd like to talk about?
So in regard to care experience, because of the lack of research in this area, I could only find evidence that concerned transracial placements, whether that's inter-country adoptions or, domestic adoptions, where one person of one race has moved to another family of another. And what I would find really interesting is more research that would look at same race placements and begin to see whether this experience of in-betweenness and multiplicity applies when the person has moved family from the same race or within the same country. Care experience people don't just have that experience of family change, they also have that experience of gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, neurodivergence, and it would be really interesting to see if this experience of in-betweenness is magnified by care experience also having an effect in other places other than the change in race or ethnicity. So I want to make clear that I don't just think that complex identities exists only in transracial placements and not in same race placements, whether that's foster or adoptive. It's just that there wasn't enough evidence to make a case for that. And so I wanted to only say stuff that had sources to back it up. And so what I'd really be interested in the future is, whether that sense of multiplicity persists.
Hopefully there will be a researcher out there who may look at your paper, listen to this podcast, listen to this conversation, and be inspired to think about that and put a proposal in and do some research on that subject. But I think it'd be a fascinating area to consider and really powerful to explore more further. Anthony, I think that is it for today. Just want to say thank you so much for speaking with me today. We've got Members Week coming up and this week, so there'll be further events and conversations on throughout the week. I just want to say thank you so much, Anthony. And just before we go, just anything you want to finish off with?
Yeah, it's been really lovely to have this conversation and explore this stuff. Again, if you're interested in this work, I'm sure the paper is going to be available on the links. But again, just to really highlight the expressions of self-research and the AFDIT framework as specific, actionable things that you can do in your daily work with young people.
I'm not embellishing it when I say that I think your research sits. I know they're different, but I think they're very complementary of Tam and Saria's, and that's what drew me to this in the first place. I think it's a really exciting and just powerful piece of research. So I just think thank you for doing it, and it's eye-opening. And I think when if people have the time to pay attention to it, it will change people's ways of thinking. It's changed mine.
Earlier episodes, visit corambaaf.org.uk.